You don't find too many genuine people like him. So to lose that light at such a young age under these circumstances has been absolutely difficult, which is why we've gone this route. There's so many people out in the public asking all of these questions, but the only question that we have is what happened to our son. That is the only question.
Here during a 4th of July boating trip with his friends. The case is now drawing national attention.
Tragedy in Mississippi, taking the life of young Emmett Till. We will stand up for Nolan Wells.
On the 4th of July, a group of friends took a boat out to a barrier island off the Mississippi coast. 2 days later, one of them was dead, and nobody could agree on why. 18-year-old Nolan Wells never came home from that trip, and months later, after 2 separate autopsies, investigators still cannot say exactly how he died. This is a case built on missing answers, and today we're going to go through everything that is actually known. If stories like this matter to you, take a second right now to like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Real True Crime Analysis with notifications on. It genuinely helps this channel keep covering cases like Nolan's with the care they deserve. Now, let's get into what happened. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a student and a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. He was from Ocean Springs, a small coastal city with the kind of tight community where everybody tends to know everybody. By all accounts, he had his whole life ahead of him. On July 4th, 2026, he joined a group of friends for what was supposed to be a normal holiday outing. A boat trip out to Horn Island, a barrier island off the Gulf Coast that's popular for day trips during the summer. The group with him was mostly white, and Nolan was seen in photos and video from that day as one of the few black faces in a large, festive crowd on the island. For most of the day, it looked like any other 4th of July. People were swimming, drinking, celebrating. But at some point that evening, something changed. The boat carrying Nolan and his friends either broke down or experienced some kind of problem, though the full details of what exactly happened mechanically have not been made fully public. What we do know is that when the group left the island that night, Nolan did not leave with them. Around 11 p.m., one of the friends who had been on the trip called Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, to tell her that Nolan was missing. Imagine getting that call. Your son went out for a holiday boat trip, and now someone is telling you he's not with them anymore, and nobody seems to know exactly why he was left behind. The accounts of what happened on that island and why Nolan didn't return with the group have been inconsistent from the start. Some versions suggest he chose to stay behind, expecting to catch a ride with someone else later. Sheriff Ledbetter, who has led the investigation, said early on that the account suggested Nolan wanted to remain on the island. But people who knew him have pushed back hard on that idea. A friend named Javen Williams said that explanation didn't match the Nolan he knew at all. And this is where things start to get complicated. Ben Crump, the civil rights attorney representing the Wells family, has said that the boys who were with Nolan gave accounts that contained contradictions, including different versions of why he was left on the island in the first place. When the people who were physically present can't agree on the basic sequence of events, that's not a small detail. That's the kind of inconsistency that makes investigators and the public start asking harder questions. For 2 days, Nolan Wells was missing. Search efforts were underway around Horn Island, and his family was left waiting for any word. Then, on the morning of July 6th, his body was found in the water just off the island. The discovery of his body didn't end the questions. If anything, it multiplied them. Was this a tragic accident, a young man stranded overnight who ended up in dangerous water? Or was there something else at play, something that hadn't been disclosed by the people who left him behind? At this point in the investigation, nobody outside of law enforcement can say for certain. What we can say is that the case immediately drew national attention, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of the racial context surrounding it. A young black man, the only person of color in a mostly white group of friends, dies after being left alone on an island in a state with a difficult and well-documented history around race. That combination was always going to raise questions, whether or not race played any direct role in what happened to Nolan. So, where did the investigation go from there? What did the sheriff's office find when they examined the scene? And why, months later, are there still two competing autopsy reports that can't agree on how Nolan Wells died? That's where we're headed next. When Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind examined Nolan's body, he said publicly that there were no immediate, obvious signs of foul play or trauma. That statement offered some reassurance to a public hungry for answers, but it didn't close the case. The state medical examiner's office still needed to run toxicology tests, and until those results came back, the full official autopsy would not be released. Meanwhile, Sheriff Ledbetter's office said no foul play had been identified at that time. Careful language that left the door open without confirming anything either way. As the investigation continued, authorities interviewed around 60 witnesses. The FBI also became involved, helping examine digital evidence, likely phones, photos, and video from the day of the trip. That's a significant number of witnesses for a case that some initially assumed might be a simple accidental drowning. It suggests investigators were taking the inconsistencies seriously and trying to build a complete picture of what actually happened on that island and on that boat. Standard procedure in Jackson County calls for a grand jury to review any suspicious death once the sheriff's investigation is complete. That's important to understand because a grand jury review doesn't necessarily mean investigators suspect a crime. It's a routine step for cases like this. But given the national spotlight on Nolan's death, that routine process took on much more weight in the public eye. The family, understandably unsatisfied with an incomplete official picture, brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Reverend Al Sharpton also became involved, and a reward fund for information leading to an arrest and conviction grew to $125,000, with contributions from Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and Terrell Owens. That kind of financial commitment tells you how much public concern had built around this case by that point. Then came a decision that would define the next phase of this story. The family decided to commission their own independent autopsy, separate from the state's official examination. They brought in Dr. Roger Mitchell, Jr., a board-certified forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience and president of the National Medical Association. This second autopsy was privately funded, paid for by civil rights activist Colin Kaepernick. On July 22nd, weeks after Nolan's death, and just days after his funeral in Ocean Springs, Crump stood at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago alongside Nolan's parents, Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley, and released Mitchell's preliminary findings. What came out of that report was not a clean answer. It was a list of complications. Mitchell wrote that he could not establish a definitive cause and manner of death. He described several limitations he faced during his examination. The most significant, he said, was that he couldn't directly observe the airway and lungs for water or examine the stomach for gastric contents. On top of that, the original toxicology results hadn't been received at the time of his report. There was another complication that raised eyebrows. Mitchell said he didn't have access to all of Nolan's remains. Specifically, certain neck structures, including the trachea, laryngeal cartilages, and the hyoid bone, were not returned with the body after the state's initial autopsy. Mitchell acknowledged that retaining these structures for additional testing is actually a common and accepted forensic practice, especially when there's any concern about fracture or compression in that area. But because he didn't have them, he stated plainly that he could not rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to or cause of death. Does that detail seem unusual to you? On one hand, it's explained as standard procedure. On the other hand, it left a real gap in what the independent examiner could conclude. That's the kind of nuance this case keeps running into. Nothing is a smoking gun, but nothing is fully resolved either. Mitchell's report did include one specific physical finding: red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. He was careful not to draw conclusions from it. It wasn't clear what caused that discoloration, or whether it had any connection to Nolan's death at all. He also noted he found no apparent lacerations, fractures, or deep tissue injuries, though he pointed out that decomposition can obscure surface bruising, especially in a second examination performed after the body has already been through one autopsy. Because of everything he encountered, Mitchell listed 7 outstanding questions that still needed answers. These included what led Nolan to enter the water in the first place, whether there was water in his airway consistent with drowning, and whether he had any brain bleed. Crump summarized it directly, saying the condition of Nolan Wells before he entered the water would be the crux of the matter. In other words, the most important moment in this entire case might be the one nobody has fully accounted for yet, the time between when his friends left the island and when his body ended up in the water. Crump was blunt in his final assessment of the report. He said that based on Mitchell's findings, this pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening, non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. That's a significant statement, but it's important to understand exactly what it means and doesn't mean. It is not a declaration that a crime occurred. It's an acknowledgement that the evidence available couldn't eliminate that possibility. For balance, it's worth mentioning what an outside forensic pathologist, Dr. Priya Banerjee, said about this situation. She noted that second autopsies come with an inherent limitation because the body has already been altered by the first examination. She said it's never going to be in the same untouched state you'd get with an unexamined body. She also said it's not unusual for an independent examiner to lack access to the primary investigator's findings due to laws limiting what can be released publicly. That context matters. It doesn't mean Mitchell's concerns aren't valid, but it does mean some of the limitations he faced are fairly typical for this kind of situation, not necessarily evidence of a cover-up. So where does that leave us? The official state autopsy reportedly concluded that drowning was the cause of death, though the full report still has not been publicly released in detail. The independent autopsy could not confirm or rule out anything beyond that, and it specifically could not eliminate the possibility of non-accidental factors. 2 examinations, 2 different levels of certainty, and a family still waiting for a complete answer about how their son died. Crump has said he hopes the state medical examiner will allow Mitchell to review photographs and observations from closer to when Nolan was first recovered from the water, information that could help close some of the gaps in his own report. He's also pushing for Mitchell to be included when the Mississippi grand jury eventually reviews the findings of the full investigation. What do you think really happened on that island? Was this a tragic accident involving a stranded teenager and dangerous water conditions? Or is there something in the inconsistent accounts from that night that investigators need to dig into further? Could there be an innocent explanation for the missing neck structures and the unreleased official report? Or does the lack of transparency deserve more scrutiny? These are the questions this case keeps circling back to, and right now, nobody outside the investigation has a definitive answer. Here's what we know for certain. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He went on a boat trip with friends on the 4th of July. He was left on Horn Island when the others departed that night, under circumstances that remain disputed. His body was found in the water 2 days later. The official cause of death has been reported as drowning, but the full report has not been made public, and an independent pathologist has said he cannot rule out other contributing factors due to significant limitations in his examination. What we don't know is just as important. We don't know exactly what happened between the time Nolan's friends left the island and the moment he ended up in the water. We don't know why the accounts from those who were present contain contradictions. We don't know the full contents of the official autopsy or the toxicology results. And we don't know what, if anything, a grand jury will ultimately conclude when they review this case. This is a story still being written. Nolan Wells' family continues to push for full transparency, and the investigation is ongoing. As more information becomes available, whether that's the complete toxicology results, the full official autopsy, or any grand jury findings, this case will likely continue to evolve. We want to hear from you. What details in this case stand out to you the most? Do you think the inconsistencies in the friends' accounts point to something more than an accident? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below, and let's discuss what you think really happened to Nolan Wells. If you found this analysis informative, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Real True Crime Analysis, and turn on notifications so you never miss another investigation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.